Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about how not everyone is a narcissist. I've had some heavy episodes the past few weeks, so I thought I'd go into one that might be a little more fun, but still informative. So, a narcissist. Calling someone a narcissist seems to be a little bit of a more common thing nowadays. It appears, at least on my end, to be what pop psychology is starting to take on as its new movement. We've started to drift away from calling people codependent. Interestingly enough, I think those two accusations tend to be very similar. But this pop psychology thing, I think we can make sense of and appreciate. We don't really need to take it super seriously. I will tell you, narcissism is a clinical issue. It's not a social one per se. When I'm going to talk about narcissism, I'm going to give you some exact points on what narcissism really is. I will say there are going to be some narcissistic tendencies that we see, although the diagnosis, narcissistic personality disorder, is very distinct. While we call people narcissists, it's just things that reflect that. If it's a helpful comparison, people will say I'm OCD when in reality they're just a little bit too focused on things. It's kind of in the same category as that. The last thing that I will say as part of this introduction, as a therapist and as a researcher, it's always interesting that when people talk about others being narcissistic, it's really funny that apparently only other people are narcissists. I don't ever really hear people say on the internet or social media that they are a narcissist. It's always an accusation thrown at someone else. So, what are narcissists? They are not people who are just selfish. Being selfish, again, is not a clinical diagnosis. It can be a part of a clinical diagnosis, but quite honestly, that's not enough to call someone a narcissist. They're selfish. They're self-centered. Doesn't really cut it. Someone is not a narcissist when they don't consider your feelings or expectations. There can be a good reason for that. Let's say my child is about to run out into traffic. And they do that because they really want to leave the store and go home. If I yank them out of the road, am I, quote unquote, considering their feelings or social expectations? No. But is it a good thing to do? Yes. That doesn't make me a narcissist. Okay? Just because someone does things that you do not like, they do things that are uncomfortable or seem offensive to you, it doesn't make them a narcissist. I will say a narcissist isn't someone who is just mean. People can be self-centered. They can have bad days. There are many cases where people can come off as narcissists when really they're just driven in their minds in another place. You also cannot call someone a narcissist when you just don't get your way. What's really interesting about calling someone a narcissist is if we were to look at things objectively, the people making the accusation fit it to some degree. I made a comment earlier on in this episode that narcissist has replaced codependent as an accusation. Same thing applies there. It's always interesting how someone's partner or other person is codependent, when in reality, the word codependent has a prefix, CO. The first two letters, it means two. You can only be codependent with someone else. So typically when people start making this accusation, there's a little bit of truth of it in themselves. I will say the last thing around narcissism isn't when someone's done with a situation. It's not when they're worn out and they're ready for it to be over. So I hope I've successfully clubbed the social definition of a narcissist. It's not just when someone's mean. It's not when someone doesn't consider you a priority. It's something entirely different. So let me give you a clinical explanation. What is narcissism really? Okay. Narcissism is known from a clinical diagnosis as narcissistic personality disorder. It is primarily an issue of observing ego. If you haven't heard that term before, I would encourage you to go look it up. It's really fascinating, and I'm absolutely sure it's going to be the topic of a podcast episode at some point. But observing ego is the ability to see outside of yourself. You can think of it as a floating eye that moves around the room, takes other people's perspectives, how they might see you, how you might see them, other people's internal experiences. Narcissists, like all of the personality disorders, suffer from this issue. They are unable to examine and value other people's internal experiences. The difference between someone with true narcissistic personality disorder and someone who could be considered somewhat narcissistic is that someone who is somewhat narcissistic can understand and empathize with someone else's internal experience and chooses not to follow through with it, while someone with true narcissistic personality disorder has no conception of other people's internal experiences. They just assume that everybody thinks like them. There's a term for this. It's called egocentrism. It's this idea of, well, how little children think. Everything happens for me, by me, because of me. The football team won, it's because I cheered loud enough. If they didn't win, it's because I wasn't paying attention. If I tripped on the sidewalk, I get to blame the sidewalk for being mean to me. That's what true personality disorders are. That's what a true lack of observing ego is. The ability or the inability to see outside of yourself. True narcissists, they have an issue with seeing internally in themselves and in others. It's not that they reject other points of view. It's that they just don't see them. People with true narcissistic personality disorder will be confused when you explain an opposing viewpoint. They'll find it frustrating, as if you're lying to them, as if what they really want is somehow true for everybody else. They really deserve that promotion. Why? Because they're God's great gift to this green earth. How could everyone not see it? It's not that they have a self-inflated ego. It's just they have an ego that cannot see outside of it. They can't perceive that others would consider anything other than what they see as truth. Let me reiterate that in a slightly different way. True narcissists, those with narcissistic personality disorder, do not struggle with their own point of view. They think that their point of view is the truth. They have no conception of points of views outside of their own. Narcissism can be connected to other diagnoses and terminology, but not in full diagnoses. I'm going to give some examples of where you can see quote unquote narcissism, and even sometimes where there can be a misdiagnosis. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Personality disorders all suffer from a lack of observing ego. It's one of the reasons that working with people with these types of disorders is incredibly difficult. Therapy is an inherent exchange between the therapist and client or patient. If the client or patient is unable to see outside of themselves, it makes it incredibly difficult to be empathetic and engaged. So it makes therapy really, really hard, and part of the reason it makes it take so long in order to see results. So personality disorders, a huge case where you see narcissism. You can actually see misdiagnoses within the personality disorder realm. Other places where we see narcissism, severe addiction. I have heard many times in my office, my husband, my wife, my partner, my child is so narcissistic. They only see their own point of view. Well, someone's in addiction. They're hyper egocentric. They don't look outside of themselves. What does this look like? Well, the alcoholic who walks into my office and swears up and down, well, they didn't know I was drinking. I hid it really well. No, you didn't. People just didn't say anything. Remember, egocentrism, unable to see outside of yourself. So in severe addiction, people often get labeled as narcissists because in some capacity, they are. They only see their point of view as important. They will steal, lie, connive, whatever it is, to keep from having to look at deeper issues. And what they believe is truth, they should have others believe for some reason. So in that case, yeah, if you have an addiction to heroin and it's running your life, you will alienate, not consider, and sometimes be completely blind to what other people experience. I've also seen some narcissistic tendencies with moderate to severe mental health disorders. If we were to look at something like schizophrenia, people with that diagnosis can very obviously struggle to see outside of themselves because their internal experience is so chaotic. They can become narcissistic in the sense that it's so loud, how could they look at anything else? That one makes sense. Let's take something, though, like severe depression. Those that become incredibly depressed become incredibly egocentric and lack observing ego. They become incredibly narcissistic. Everyone should feel bad for me. People with severe depression might reject the idea that they need other people to take care of them. Here's the thing, though. They need other people to ignore it, make sense of it, or make accommodations for them. So while they might reject the sense that other people are caring for them, their depression is hinged on it. Other things in depression where a lack of observing ego and narcissism is present is suicide. I know this isn't quite the nicest thing to say in the world, and people aren't too keen on hearing it, but suicide is incredibly selfish. It's incredibly egocentric. It's incredibly lacking in observing ego. People take their own lives, at least in most scenarios, because they feel that there's no hope for the future, neglecting the fact that other people need them, or other people are encouraged by their presence so they can still contribute something to the world. So in severe depression, hyper-egocentrism, a lack of observing ego, can make people narcissistic. You can also see narcissism in other things like bipolar disorder. People are manic. They think everything is happening right now and they have to deal with it. That one's a little more obvious. But if you are someone who really wants to look up narcissistic personality disorder, the most current diagnostic and statistical manual at the time of recording this episode is the DSM-5-TR. Now, you might not be able to look that up online. I tried before recording this episode, and the criteria isn't easily accessible. So I'm going to read off a little bit of it. That way you can get an idea of what true narcissistic personality disorder is. You can find this diagnosis on page 760 of the DSM-5-TR. That's something you have access to. All right, so here we have the criteria. They are a grandiose sense of importance. They are someone who requires admiration. They have a distinct amount of entitlement. They lack empathy, are assuming that others are envious of them. They have arrogant behaviors, and their internal understanding of identity is incredibly fragile. Typically, narcissistic personality disorder begins in early adulthood. It doesn't begin when someone's 25. It doesn't begin when someone's 3. So, what is the prevalence in other disorders? If you're unaware of that, it's how often can this disorder exist with something else or be lumped in an inappropriate way? Well, it seems on these pages of the DSM, there's some contention. In some cases, narcissistic personality disorder is outright rejected. But interestingly enough, if you're looking on page 760 and you follow along, there's a prevalence of 6.2% in someone with alcoholism as a disorder. Now, take a second. You heard me just a minute ago talk about how alcoholics and addicts could be considered narcissistic, but aren't really. Okay, so here's where the conflict comes in. Which one comes first in the diagnostic criteria? Is someone an alcoholic in expressing narcissistic tendencies, or are they a narcissist who also abuses alcohol? Might be a little too complicated for one episode, but you get the idea here. It's interesting, though, because some are arguing whether narcissistic personality disorder even exists. And then there's also the 6.2% in alcoholism. Here's the last thing I'll say on the clinical side. You probably will not date someone who has this disorder. Unless you have a position of power or authority and they want to use you as a stepping stool, you will not run into them. Why is that? Well, the general dating pool is not a place of really social upward mobility. We tend to date people that are in the same area as us, whether that's economically, socially, even in a looks-based environment. We tend to get with people that are around the same capacity as we are, so probably won't date a true narcissist. One of the other reasons you probably won't date a narcissist is because, my goodness, they won't really look at others long enough to be able to date them. Again, there's a difference between being narcissistic and truly having the disorder. So now that we know the reality of the clinical diagnosis, what's happening? Why all of a sudden are we talking about narcissism in the general public? I will tell you, children in the emotionally immature can appear narcissistic because they have a limited point of view. I have met 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds who have the emotional maturity of a child or an adolescent. Are they narcissistic? Yes, it's because they never grew up. People who have the unofficial diagnosis of failure to launch, the people that are in their 20s or 30s that still never left home and became independent, absolutely are narcissistic. They might seem genuine and nice, but they are unable to perceive that they should leave, that other people would be better off if they grew up. So in that case, the emotionally immature are absolutely narcissistic. Even those that have some sort of independence can appear narcissistic. They would struggle to maintain relationships, though, because having an air of narcissism wears off after a certain point. They don't actually contribute a whole lot to other people, and so they can seem charming, but eventually people leave. I mentioned it just a second ago that children are narcissistic. If you've never been around a kid, if you're not a parent, I will tell you, children are incredibly narcissistic. As this loving parent, I can't explain to a little kid, hey, your point of view isn't good. You're being narcissistic. I get it. Kids struggle with emotions. It's a hard thing to deal with. But if we're going by definition's sake, kids are narcissistic. The hope is they grow out of it through empathy and engagement with others and honest conversations with their parents. Unfortunately, though, those kids stay narcissistic. Then they become adolescents and teenagers and adults, and they demand everything from everyone else without taking any responsibility for themselves. What else is happening in the real world? I will tell you, scared and defensive people tend to overplay their hand. The defense mechanism. Some people might seem narcissistic as a way to defend themselves. They might feel as if they have nothing to offer. So the only thing they can do is focus on themselves. It's like they're always running on empty. Are these people truly narcissistic in the clinical sense? No, they're just very hurt and struggle to engage with others. Does that mean we have to have over empathy and give them everything? No, it doesn't help them grow. So to the person who always feels like they need and others should support, provide for them, it doesn't do this person any good to be there and overly support them because it reinforces that narcissistic dynamic. For those that are listening to this podcast and say, well, I'm dating someone who's narcissistic, or I'm engaged or married, or maybe I have a friend that's like that. Here's a good question. Why would you be with someone who is like that? I'm assuming everyone listening to this podcast, and I have the same assumption as a therapist, that people generally aren't stupid. There's a reason why we do what we do. So I asked the question, if you're in a relationship with someone you believe is narcissistic, why would you do that? It probably has something to do with you. Now, this isn't to blame someone for abuse or terrible behavior, but something is driving people. I don't think people are stupid to do things for no reason. So if you're with someone who's a narcissist, there's probably something in you that hopes to fix their dynamic, would give you identity or a sense of meaning to be able to adjust their field of view or to help them make sense of the world. If you're wondering what to do with all of this information, I would ask you to figure out, sit and think through, or talk with someone who's knowledgeable on this stuff. If the person you're wanting to help, intervene with, or confront, figure out if they are immature, addicted, or if there is a deeper issue present. There are different interventions for all of these things. If someone's immature, and that's why they're narcissistic, time to grow up. Get a job. Realize the world doesn't revolve around you and no one knows you anything. We're all in this world together. Everyone has to contribute. Sorry that work is hard. If you're thinking of someone who's addicted, okay, they got to be sober if you don't want them to be narcissistic anymore. At least that's a big first step. If there's a deeper issue at play, that's where good therapy comes in. So what do we do with all of this? Go ahead and get rid of the idea that everyone's a narcissist or just the people you don't like. Stop diagnosing politicians and public figures as narcissists. You only get a small fraction of what's going on in people's lives. For you yourself, wonder if you could show narcissistic qualities or why you would tolerate them in your life. And if so, take a step back and see what you can do about it. Thanks for listening today. Hope you got something useful out of today's episode. If you feel so inclined, I would ask that you follow this podcast to get the weekly downloads. Share it with people that might find it interesting or helpful. And if you want to leave a tip to help pay for the production of this podcast, do so at one of the links below. Thank you and have a great day.